London at the height of the Blitz smelled of coal and wet stone, of cordite and the iron tang left by shattered glass. Sirens threaded the nights like a second language. The blackout turned familiar streets into folds of velvet, a dark cloth the city wore in common grief. Under that cloth, patterns shifted. Shelters filled with neighbors who would never speak again. Shopfronts became scavenger markets. Authority thinned at the edges, while a different kind of authority tightened its grip in pubs, cellars, and the shadowed rooms behind boarded windows. War, which rearranged nations, rearranged opportunity. Where government attention narrowed to survival, the margins widened for those willing to exploit them. This is the study of those margins. Across London, Paris, Frankfurt, and New York, wartime and its chaotic aftermath created corridors for theft, betrayal, and the astonishing audacity of men and networks who traded in secrecy. Their stories are not glamour, but consequence. The rise of a gangster who learned to run a criminal corporation amid incendiary raids. A physician in occupied Paris whose trajectory crossed fraud with murder. The theft of a province's crown jewels in the confusion of occupation and defeat. And a negotiated collusion between American naval planners and organized crime that altered the underworld's reach. Each case is different in scale and brutality, but together they reveal a pattern. Crisis distorts norms, and people with means, muscle, or access find ways to profit. The record is uneven, the testimonies fragmentary, the law sometimes late. Yet when archival files, trial records, and the testimony of survivors are stitched together, an unsettling picture emerges of wartime crime as both opportunism and corrosion. In the East End, William "Billy" Hill had learned to read a city by the angles that others missed. Born into working-class London at the cusp of the century, Hill moved through illicit trades with a measured gaze. Petty theft and protection rackets in youth, bigger scores when the chance arrived. The Blitz gave him the chance. Bombs cleared streets not only of people, but of older social structures. Property ownership blurred in the ruins, and looting became both necessity and enterprise. Where legitimate supply chains sputtered, black markets thrived. Petrol rationing and coupon forgery became as valuable as firearms. Hill's name came to stand for a new model, part street boss, part manager, able to coordinate disparate sets of men with a spreadsheet mind concealed behind a wartime bluntness. A recurrent image in police files and witness recollections places him at the center of a Soho backroom meeting as the sirens began their wail. Men argued in low voices about where to find goods, who had the railway connections, who controlled transport. Hill listened, not like a man waiting to command, but like a man mapping the city's bloodlines. He moved money with a calm that pulled violent edges taut into purpose.
"You get the coupons?" a courier asked, breath fogging in the cellar air. "They're valid until February," Hill said, the words flat, the light from a single candle catching on a scar along his knuckle. "But circulation is thin. We'll exchange at 50 for one. Keep the vans on the north side. If the ARP wards check, let the driver hand over a burnt permit. We recover the rest tonight." These reconstituted lines are dramatizations of plausible exchanges drawn from police notes and merchants' testimonies. They do not appear in any one file, but are consistent with the modus operandi documented in wartime arrests. Hill's strategy was not merely theft, it was supply chain control, cornering commodities, using violence not as spectacle, but as a form of enforcement. When the city's rationing tokens were forged or diverted, entire grocery routes depended on a handful of men who could guarantee delivery. Where the state's reach faltered, overstretched, under-resourced, criminal networks filled the gap. Hill's ascent had a cost. Authorities took notice. In 1942, arrested after a violent altercation that drew police attention, Hill was imprisoned. His incarceration did not end the structure he had helped build. It formalized it. The files from the Metropolitan Police show a shift. Hill's name, even from a cell, became an organizing label for a more professionalized underworld, one that mimicked legitimate businesses with ledgers, intermediaries, and trustees. In many ways, the wartime underworld had become a wartime firm. Legibility, accounts, and a chain of command that survived bomb blasts and blackouts. The Blitz had been a crucible. Out of it came a new model of organized crime that would endure into the post-war years. Across the Channel, in occupied Paris, an altogether different darkness settled. Not merely the blackout of sirens and lamps, but the moral darkness of collaboration and survival. For many Parisians, daily life under occupation was negotiation. How to get bread and coal, how to hide what was necessary, how to avoid denunciation. Within that compressed world, Marcel Piot's trajectory is one of chilling pragmatism and ruthlessness. A physician by training, Piot's professional standing gave him access to fragile lives and the corridors of the occupiers. The archival trail is precise about certain outcomes. He was tried and executed on 25 May 1946. Between those dates lies a record of fraud, exploitation of deportation procedures, and, according to trial documents, murders whose victims included some who had sought his help. Piot's profession allowed him to move between the official and the clandestine. His surgeries and pharmaceutical orders placed him into supply chains other citizens could not reach.
Testimony at his trial points to a pattern. Medical authority used to falsify documents to certify removals as voluntary or health-related, to manipulate the administrative machinery that funneled people into deportation queues. The records are careful to distinguish between documented administrative facilitation, falsified certificates, corrupt attestations, and allegations of homicidal intent. Judicial papers treat each claim with evidentiary caution, yet what emerges is a portrait of a man who weaponized professional trust. Victim statements describe the opaque domesticity of his practice, the hiss of a kerosene heater, the surgical instruments laid out like blunt promises, the way a coat was slipped around shoulders while a family was told they would be safer if they relocated. The words used in court and in survivor testimonies aim to avoid luridness, instead cataloging outcomes: disappearance, roundup, deportation. Where physical detail is unnecessary and harmful, it is omitted from files. The human toll is recorded in absence, in empty chairs at kitchen tables, in lists of those never returned. For historians, Piot's case is emblematic of a war's administrative violence, how ordinary bureaucratic acts, perverted by self-interest or ideology, become instruments of death. Meanwhile, in the wreckage of imperial estates and aristocratic storerooms, treasure moved in shadows. The Hesse crown jewels, symbols of lineage and authority, became one of the era's quieter dramas. Post-war Germany was a field of contradictory forces. Occupying troops, displaced persons, opportunistic civilians, and organized looters all navigated the same ruined architecture. Large houses with locked vaults and long-served safes suddenly stood empty by decree or by death. In the confusion, the theft of provincial regalia took on both literal and symbolic weight. Jewels that had long signified continuity found themselves unmoored in a world of requisitions and exigencies. Investigations into the jewels' disappearance reveal fault lines between the official processes of restitution and the informal economies that emerged. Soldiers, civilians, and intermediaries all found ways to traffic valuables. The files indicate organized networks, contacts in ports, falsified transport papers, hidden compartments in military vehicles. For those who watched the slow reconstitution of state authority after 1945, the theft was not only a material crime, but an emblem of the fragility of cultural continuity. The jewels were not merely valuable, they were artifacts of legitimacy. Their loss suggested that some spoils of war were redirected from public restitution into private accumulation. In forensic reports and courier logs, legal authorities traced routes, Frankfurt to Kronberg to distant ports, shipments masked as agricultural equipment, crates coded under innocuous labels. For those who watched the slow reconstitution of state authority after 1945, the theft was not only a material crime but an emblem of the fragility of cultural continuity. The jewels were not merely valuable, they were artifacts of legitimacy. Their loss suggested that some spoils of war were redirected from public restitution into private accumulation. In forensic reports and courier logs, legal authorities traced routes, Frankfurt to Kronberg to distant ports, shipments masked as agricultural equipment, crates coded under innocuous labels. In one interrogatory, a mid-level arranger described loading a trunk beneath sacks of flour and receiving a soldier's nod in lieu of payment. Testimony often carried the weary resignation of men who had seen too much. When institutions collapse or retreat, prospective gainers will map new pathways. The Atlantic and Mediterranean theaters produced a different calculus. In New York and along the Sicilian coast, the story of Charles Lucky Luciano is among the most revealed and the most debated. Luciano, a towering figure in American organized crime, offered logistical expertise at a moment when Allied planners confronted a difficult reality: how to secure docks, silence saboteurs, and ensure the safe arrival of troops in a hemisphere where underworld control of waterfronts and labor was both a threat and a resource. The arrangement that developed, often termed with shorthand references in later press, paired military needs with illegal operators. Documents in naval records, now declassified in part, show that the Office of Naval Intelligence assessed that cooperation with certain underworld figures could reduce the risk of strikes and sabotage in key ports. Luciano's role has been characterized as pragmatic and transactional. He was serving a sentence at the time, but his influence over dock workers and unions and his network in New York and Sicily made him an attractive interlocutor. The Navy's willingness to negotiate, offering reduced sentences or influence in exchange for assistance, has been criticized by contemporaries and historians alike. The moral calculus was stark: wartime exigency against legal principle. The historical record suggests both immediate benefits, some shipments secured, certain strikes diffused, and longer-term costs. Once lines of cooperation were opened, they did not disappear with the cessation of hostilities. Luciano was deported in 1946, a clear legal consequence, but the networked ties he had helped reinforce persisted. Scholars who study these interactions emphasize the architecture of choice. Historian Dr. Miriam Hell-Hart, Naval History Institute, notes that wartime collaborations were not inevitable. They were decisions shaped by fear, pre-existing relationships, and the perceived urgency of military objectives. For naval planners worried about sabotage, the calculus favored quick fixes. For gang leaders, the war presented an opportunity to legitimize influence under the veneer of patriotism. The resulting blend of improvised alliances and opportunism created new forms of resilience for criminal networks in the post-war era. Policing adapted unevenly. Across Europe, police forces were strained, sometimes compromised, sometimes reconstituted under occupation authorities. Investigations into wartime crimes frequently collided with political priorities: the pressing need for reconstruction, the delicate politics of collaboration and purges, and the shifting priorities of newly sovereign states. In some cases, files gathered during the war were repurposed to settle scores. In others, evidence evaporated in the chaos of displacement and shortage. For victims, this unpredictability compounded trauma. For perpetrators with social acumen, it created loopholes. The methods of detection after the war often combined old techniques with emerging forensic practices. Detectives leaned on ledgers, postal records, and testimony, but also on the growing use of forensic science to establish time of death, cause, and custody. Where cutting physical description would be gratuitous or harmful, reports listed remains recovered or decomposed beyond identification. Forensic pathologists, when called, framed explanations in measured terms. Jurists relied on procedural caution. Trials like that of Marcel Piot exemplified this tension. The need to weigh medical testimony, administrative records, and affidavits under conditions where the best evidence, witnesses, physical records, was sometimes compromised. The human dimension threaded through every file. Families of the disappeared filed petitions at municipal offices, pressing for lists of deported persons, for the names that would allow the state to act. Journalists pieced together narratives from transport logs and rumor networks, sometimes forcing reluctant officials to reveal gaps. Survivors who testified at trials spoke rarely of spectacle and more often of the ordinary ruptures: a child missing from school, a neighbor's sudden absence, the slow accumulation of small betrayals that led to definitive loss. Where possible, the narrative avoids lurid details and focuses on consequence, the social fabric that unraveled when trust was broken. In London, the Blitz had altered criminal opportunity in ways both immediate and structural. Hill's horizontals, the men who carried boxes, falsified coupons, and ran protection, found new roles in smuggling and in controlling ration distribution. In Soho's bombed-out clubs, music revived briefly after air raids, pairing defiance with commerce. The rooftop chimneys, the smell of wet wood, and the ash of burned curtains were the city's sensory markers. They also provided concealment. Blackout curtains hung not only over windows, but over the logic of ownership. For some, this was survival. For others, it was profit. When the flames of espionage and warfare cooled, the legal apparatus sought accountability. Trials were sometimes swift, sometimes staggered. Sentences varied. Hill's imprisonment in 1942 was a blow to his direct operations, but not always to the networks he had helped institutionalize. Piot's execution in 1946 marked a legal reckoning with the most egregious abuse of professional authority in occupied Paris. Luciano's deportation in 1946 marked an assertion of state sovereignty, even as his networks sustained themselves. The theft of the Hesse regalia remained a cautionary tale about the fate of cultural artifacts during upheaval and the limits of restitution when resources were insufficient to reach every wrong. Experts interviewed in the post-war decades offer a sober account. Archival Card, Ministry of Reconstruction, 1947, notes the difficulties in recovering dispersed property. Investigators flagged that many shipments labeled as food or supplies were used to move valuables clandestinely. Historian Dr. Anja Reuter, University of Frankfurt, underlines the interplay between scarcity and moral erosion. When basic necessities are unreliable, some see crime as a rational adaptation. The conclusion is not a defense but an explanation. Certain structural pressures made illegal choices more likely, but did not erase responsibility. Yet responsibility in the post-war legal world was uneven. Where collaboration with occupying forces formed part of a political and moral calculus, courts and purges grappled with degrees of complicity. Administrative crimes, fraudulent certifications, forged documents, were sometimes judged less severely than acts of violence, though their consequences could be equally catastrophic. This asymmetry is visible in archives: lists, signatures, and seals that, when invalidated, led to deportation orders or property seizures. The paper trail, meant to document authority, could be used to conceal theft. Throughout these stories runs a motif, darkness both literal and metaphorical. The blackout of London and the dimmed lamps of occupied Paris shared a function beyond the immediate tactical. They became metaphors for the opacity of moral choices. In basements where deals were struck, in back rooms where forged documents were signed, people negotiated their values against the urgency of wartime exigency. Some chose solidarity, others chose self-advantage. War survived on many forms of labor: soldiers, factory workers, civil servants, but it also fed the labor of those who trafficked in crisis. For investigators, the work after the fact was painstaking. Detectives audited ledgers recovered from safe deposit boxes, cross-referenced train manifests with black market receipts, interrogated middlemen who refused to be upfront without a guarantee. The tone of many reports is weary. The country needed bread more than trials, the government needed reconstruction more than investigations, but legal obligations demanded action. These competing priorities shaped outcomes. A prosecution that proceeded immediately after the war might be slowed by shortages of staff and by the urgent needs of reestablishment. Some perpetrators slipped through the cracks, others were prosecuted with the full force available. The societal consequences extended beyond legal verdicts. The normalization of certain illicit markets, be it ration coupon forgery, smuggling, or the informal appropriation of property, left legacies in governance and public trust.
In places where collaboration tainted local officials, communities had to negotiate memory, reparations, and taboo. Rebuilding a public life required not only infrastructure but also a re-establishment of civic norms. Where trust had been compromised, it took years, sometimes generations, to repair. Yet the record is not one of total collapse. Within these same files are accounts of resistance, of ordinary citizens who choked off black markets, who organized watch groups, who risked denunciation to hide their neighbors. The FFI and other resistance groups, while primarily focused on occupation forces, sometimes engaged in policing of wartime profiteers. Where legal and moral lines converged, communities acted to enforce them. These acts of civic courage became part of the counter-narrative to opportunism. When historians compile these threads, the goal is not a blanket indictment of whole populations, but a careful mapping of incentives, choices, and consequences. War creates distortions. Some adapt with integrity, others with calculation. The stories of Hill, Pio, Luciano, and the thefts of post-war Germany are cautionary not because they are exceptional, but because they show how familiar mechanisms, authority, supply, social networks, can be redirected toward harm when accountability is weak. As archival boxes are opened and new witnesses are interviewed, the shape of these crimes becomes clearer and yet more complex. Trial transcripts provide procedural rigor. Oral histories supply texture. Forensic accounting reveals the flows of goods and money. Each source has limits. Memory fades. Records burn. Motives are occluded. The historian's duty is to triangulate, to give weight to corroborated facts, and to treat allegation with due skepticism while honoring victims' accounts. In reconstructing these stories for contemporary readers, care is taken to avoid sensationalism. Violence is recorded and condemned, but not exploited for drama. Administrative complicity is described in bureaucratic terms when appropriate, precisely because it is the mundane instrument of great harm. The behind-the-scenes machinations, bribed clerks, falsified manifests, the quiet nods at docks, are often the most damning evidence of how wartime disruption enabled crime. The post-war consequences ranged from imprisonment and execution to the more insidious, the embedding of criminal structures into peacetime economies. The networks that had moved petrol coupons and jewels now found new markets in reconstruction projects, in the management of labor, in the distribution of scarce commodities. This continuity is perhaps the darkest aftertaste of wartime opportunism, the transformation of temporary expedients into durable enterprises. Yet the public record also reveals attempts at repair.
Commission reports, restitution tribunals, and municipal efforts to list and return property demonstrate an institutional will to correct wrongs. Successes were partial but real. Families reunited with heirlooms, prosecutions that deterred would-be profiteers, and reforms in civil registry practice to prevent easy manipulation of documents. These measures, born of necessity and conscience, were themselves part of the war's aftermath, a bureaucratic reconstruction that paralleled the physical rebuilding. The moral that threads through these cases is stark. Crises reveal character in ways ordinary life does not. Some revealed courage, others revealed the capacity to turn disorder into gain. The historical record is not merely a ledger of crimes. It is a mirror for future contingencies. How institutions can better resist capture, how communities can protect their weakest, and how legal systems can be structured to act even when resources are scarce. The stories mapped here: the manager in Hill who professionalized illicit commerce, the physician in Pio who corrupted professional trust, the organized theft of symbols of state, the strategic collusion between state actors and criminal operatives, are not distant curiosities. They are case studies in the interplay of power, scarcity, and moral choice. They remind us that wartime is not solely a contest of armies, but also a contest of norms. At the close of each of these narratives sits a knot of consequences: restitution efforts, prosecutions, deportations, and institutional reforms. Some threads tie neatly: an arrest here, an execution there. Others fray, unresolved, leaving families to carry absences forward. The archival work continues. With each newly digitized file and re-examined testimony, historians adjust interpretations and add nuance. What remains constant is the lesson that emergency can create opportunity, for service and for predation, and that rebuilding a just society requires more than bricks and mortar. It requires vigilance against the ways in which human systems can be bent toward private gain when the public good is under strain. The darkness of the blackout lifts. London lights return. Paris puts out its last curfew notice. Ships resurface in cleared docks. But the shadows cast during those years left traces. Ledgers, correspondence, the faint chemical smell on a sealed crate, a signature on a false certificate. These traces are the historian's materials, small, stubborn, and telling. In reading them, the modern observer confronts the uncomfortable truth that wartime heroism and wartime opportunism can exist side by side, each shaping the next era in ways that law, policy, and memory must contend with. The task is not to sensationalize, but to remember accurately, to honor victims by documenting cause, and to inform future policy so that crisis does not become a permanent invitation to crime. If the historian's task is to read traces, then the archivist's is to choose which traces are legible and which remain sealed. Decisions made in the months and years after hostilities about what to file, what to classify, what to destroy, shaped the possibilities of later justice. In one provincial records office, a ledger tucked behind a false wall would only be rediscovered by accident decades later. In another city, the deliberate burning of municipal papers left a gap that never could be filled. The materiality of memory matters. Ink that fades, staples that rust, seals that remain unbroken. Each is an index not only of what happened, but of how institutions regarded the event. Preservation can be an act of contrition. Concealment can be an act of continued protection. Several recurring patterns appear across the archives. First, the bureaucratic language that enabled predation is often banal. A requisition note, a stamped voucher, a marginal initial. These small nothings, repeated across thousands of pages, facilitated the large thefts and the redirections of public goods. Second, the diplomacy of restitution often reduced trauma to claims and counterclaims. When ministries negotiated returns, they often did so within frameworks that privileged documentation over testimony. A deed recognized by a pre-war registry might weigh more heavily than a witness's memory of occupation and expulsion. Third, the social networks forged in war between military logicians and commercial intermediaries persisted into peacetime. Men and women who had learned how to move goods across belligerent lines found new markets in Reconstruction. Where legal systems failed to prosecute those who had profited, those networks hardened into economic cliques, shaping labor markets and procurement practices. The case of Hill, already sketched in the earlier chapters, exemplifies these dynamics. The manager who had repurposed ration cards and commandeered transport did not vanish after the armistice. Rather, he rebranded. Public needs for Reconstruction offered cover. A company formed to supply building materials to municipal projects bore his name. Its owners a handful of the same clerks who had once annotated requisitions in the margins of wartime ledgers. When investigative journalists exposed the company's origins, the ensuing scandal forced a parliamentary inquiry. The inquiry's report balanced condemnation with an oddly sympathetic tone, emphasizing the man's practical talents while recommending only limited sanctions. The result was a partial reconciliation of moral outrage and political expediency. Sanctions were modest, proceeds from a few contracts were seized, but the company continued to supply the very projects whose failures it had once exploited. Pio, the physician whose professional trust had been eroded by corrupt practice, presents another face of the post-war moral landscape. In the immediate aftermath, his clinic was shuttered, and some patients testified in a tribunal that sought to establish professional culpability.
The tribunal pieced together accounts not only of overt malfeasance, but also of distortion of care under the cover of emergency triage. The record is a study in how ethical norms fray when resources disappear. Several younger physicians, trained in the same institution, insisted at later interviews that some measures had been pragmatic, choices made to preserve life when there was little else to do. Others, including survivors who had lost relatives, insisted that the fraying was deliberate. The tribunal issued reprimands and a short suspension. It also recommended reforms in licensing and oversight that would, in theory, make similar abuses harder to replicate. Whether such reforms held is a separate matter. The professional culture, a mixture of pride, fear, and opportunism, proved more durable than any regulation. Restitution tribunals themselves are a study in compromise. Their procedures required balancing evidentiary standards with compassion for those whose papers had been lost. Some tribunals adopted expansive approaches, allowing for sworn testimony and community corroboration. Others hewed strictly to documentary proof. The difference mattered. For a widow in a town outside the capital, a neighbor's recollection of the house her family had been driven from was the only proof she could marshal. Where tribunals accepted such testimony, properties were more likely to be returned. Where they did not, claimants were left with moral but not material vindication. In many jurisdictions, international delegations, reluctant to spend scarce resources, insisted on strict documentation to reduce the administrative burden. The local effect was an uneven map of justice. Legal responses varied not only by appetite for evidence, but by political will. In some countries, restitution was foregrounded in the legislative agenda, accompanied by the creation of public compensation funds and specialized investigative departments. Elsewhere, economic instability and competing priorities relegated restitution to the margins. Legislatures passed statutes of limitations that effectively closed cases before many victims could mount claims. In that legal vacuum, private remedies, a mixture of negotiated settlements, purchases on resentful terms, and quiet transfers, took hold. The durability of these outcomes reveals something central. Law can establish frameworks for correction, but without adequate resourcing and political courage, legal redress becomes symbolic rather than restorative.
Economic reconstruction offered another arena in which moral lines blurred. Markets needed raw materials, firms needed customers, municipalities needed contractors. Where oversight was weak, contractors with wartime ties obtained public projects at preferred rates. The governance mechanisms of procurement, tender boards, oversight committees, auditing offices, were in many places reconstructed with the personnel who had managed similar systems during the war.
That continuity entrenched informal practices as routines. Some reformers argued for a wholesale replacement of personnel. Others proposed technical fixes, transparent bidding, rotating committees, independent audits. The success of such measures depended less on design than on implementation. A perfectly drafted procurement law is powerless if the municipal clerk who signs the forms has a personal stake in the winning company. Not all wartime continuities favored predation. The same networks and expertise that facilitated the movement of goods also enabled relief. Former smugglers turned to legal trade, transporting relief supplies into areas isolated by damaged infrastructure. Engineers who had repurposed plundered machinery sometimes used that knowledge to restore water systems. The same human capacities, adaptive, opportunistic, are morally neutral until put to one end or another. Recognizing this ambivalence matters because policy responses that criminalize entire categories of actors risk losing the very capacities necessary for rapid rebuilding. Memory, meanwhile, has its own politics. Post-war commemorations served varied purposes: mourning, national rehabilitation, consolidation of legitimate narratives. Governments invested in monuments and museums that emphasized heroism and unity, often downplaying internal strife and collaboration. Local communities developed alternative forms of remembering: grassroots memorials, private ceremonies for the nameless, oral histories kept within families. The archival turn, a recognition that repositories hold contested testimony, led to an expansion of collecting practices in the late 20th century. Ethnographers, journalists, and survivors groups began to deposit objects, letters, and photographs in public institutions, pressuring those institutions to broaden their definitions of relevant material. Yet even as archives opened, curators faced dilemmas about access, sensitivity to victims, and the risks of re-traumatizing witnesses through exposure. Oral history projects produced some of the most moving and difficult sources. Elders whose names had been erased by official registries told stories not only of loss but of improvisation. Gardens tended in vacuumed courtyards, covert exchanges of bread and medicine, children hidden behind the curtains of neighbors who took terrible risks. These testimonies complicate the clean moral pictures that tribunals sometimes draw. They also posed methodological challenges. Memory is fallible. It is shaped by later conversations, trauma, and the necessities of storytelling. Historians who wrote with care used triangulation, matching oral accounts with surviving ledgers, shipping manifests, or depositions, to build credible reconstructions. But the very work of cross-checking can feel like a further intrusion into wounds.
Ethical practice required sensitivity, informed consent, anonymization when demanded, and the provision of context so that testimony would not be isolated and misread. Journalism played an outsized role in shaping public perceptions of post-war theft and restitution. Investigative pieces that made use of newly released files catalyzed public outcry and pressured authorities into action. But the logics of news, attention, narrative, hero, and villain sometimes simplified complex institutional dynamics. Headlines demanded culpability and closure. Bureaucratic reforms are slow and rarely dramatic. The interplay between press exposure and political action is ambivalent. Scandals compel reformers, but they also produce scapegoats and, occasionally, superficial fixes intended to placate rather than transform. International law and diplomacy did what they could. Conventions, bilateral agreements, and multilateral declarations created frameworks for addressing the transnational aspects of wartime plunder.
Where countries shared legal cultures and administrative records, restitution proceeded more smoothly. Where legal systems diverged, claimants encountered labyrinths. The seizure of cultural objects, for instance, often implicated multiple legal regimes: export controls, customs certificates, and private bills of sale. Some museums returned items voluntarily, others only after protracted legal battles. The recovered objects are more than property. They are markers of identity, continuity, and cultural survival. Their recovery can be reparative in symbolic and material terms, but it rarely replaces what was lost in the rupture. A central theme that emerges from the archival record is the fragility of public trust. When citizens witness institutions failing to punish profiteering, or when restitution becomes an exercise in paperwork rather than in empathy, trust erodes. That erosion has long-term political consequences. Populations who feel betrayed may retreat into clientelistic politics, rewarding those who promise redistribution rather than systemic reform. Conversely, successful prosecutions and transparent restitution can strengthen institutions. They signal that the public good is resilient and that rule of law mechanisms can operate even under strain. How then should contemporary policymakers and historians think about prevention? The record suggests a set of pragmatic priorities rather than moralistic panaceas. First, build redundant systems of documentation. Multiple, dispersed records make large-scale falsification more difficult. Second, invest in rapid, well-resourced investigative units that can operate in the immediate aftermath of crisis. Delay privileges those who would convert emergency to profit. Third, design restitution procedures that balance evidentiary rigor with modes of corroborative testimony, allowing community attestations, photographs, and corroborative affidavits to count when formal deeds are unavailable. A central theme that emerges from the archival record is the fragility of public trust. When citizens witness institutions failing to punish profiteering, or when restitution becomes an exercise in paperwork rather than in empathy, trust erodes. That erosion has long-term political consequences. Populations who feel betrayed may retreat into clientelistic politics, rewarding those who promise redistribution rather than systemic reform. Conversely, successful prosecutions and transparent restitution can strengthen institutions. They signal that the public good is resilient and that rule of law mechanisms can operate even under strain.
Fourth, protect whistleblowers and journalists. Their exposure of malfeasance can be decisive. Fifth, recognize that economic reconstruction will create winners and losers. Therefore, embed anti-corruption safeguards directly into procurement frameworks, with independent oversight bodies and rotating personnel. There is also a moral case for humility. Not every wartime act that looks suspect in hindsight was simple theft. Hunger, coercion, and the chaos of survival produced choices that are morally ambiguous. Post-war societies must differentiate between those who exploited chaos for durable gain and those who made desperate choices to keep families alive. Legal systems can and should make those distinctions, but only if they are equipped with the resources, procedures, and moral imagination to do so. The scientist in the archives, the methodical reader of ink and fabric, must reckon with these ambiguities. Case files that incriminate an individual may rest on testimony given under duress. A returned ledger may itself have been assembled after the fact to create a paper trail that never existed in real time. Good historiography resists both cynicism and sentimentalism. It names complicity where it is found, it recognizes courage where it was shown, it understands that people make choices not in a vacuum but within constrained fields of possibility. At the level of daily life, the aftershocks of wartime predation reverberated for generations. Families who lost property often experienced intergenerational poverty. Children denied inheritance faced schooling and health deficits that shaped lifetime prospects. Conversely, some families who profited saw their fortunes consolidated over decades, their wealth legitimized by purchases and legal recognitions that subsequent administrations accepted. Those asymmetries contribute to long-standing patterns of inequality in certain regions, making restitution not merely a legal issue, but a component of social justice and economic policy. Memory work, commissions, museums, and commemorative education can help societies internalize the lessons. Educational curricula that incorporate local case studies about wartime profiteering and restitution can inoculate future generations against romanticized narratives of crisis. They can also teach practical civic skills, how to scrutinize public procurement, how to demand transparency, how to support oversight institutions. Civic literacy is a preventative tool as much as any legal reform. Yet institutions alone do not change hearts. The moral architecture of post-crisis societies often depends on leadership that insists on ethical norms. Political leaders who use post-war reconstruction to cement clientelistic networks undermine the long-term social good. Those who champion transparency and accountability, even at short-term political cost, help create norms that survive beyond their administrations.
The student sent a query to the conservator, who, in turn, contacted a public interest lawyer she had met at a community lecture. The lawyer, careful and deliberate, compiled a file. News moved as it often does, not as thunder, but as a series of small noises: an email, a phone call, an insistently framed photograph posted by a community group. A descendant of the street in the plate, a schoolteacher named Anna, recognized the child by a birthmark her grandmother still recalled. She brought the image into her classroom, not as accusation, but as invitation. Here is a moment. What does it tell us about who we have been and who we might become? Her students asked blunt questions about fairness and about the things people keep when others go hungry. Those questions found their way to a town hall agenda. At the meeting, the ledger-bearing conservator sat beside the lawyer, and the doctoral student sketched a timeline on flip chart paper. Voices rose and then steadied. Some spoke of legal remedy and the slow machinery of restitution. Others insisted on immediate, tangible acts: a plaque, a contribution to a local food cooperative, an oral history project. An elder, whose family name was on one of the invoices, listened with a face that tightened as memories shifted from private to public. He did not speak at first. Later, with the awkward grace of confession, he described choices made under duress and moments when convenience had hardened into advantage. No single measure satisfied everyone, but the ledger and the photograph had done their task. They had moved a latent grievance into an arena where it could be negotiated in full view. That, too, is part of repair, the reconstitution of damaged relations through processes that admit complexity, shame, and sometimes restitution, small and large. The town decided to form a working group to trace claims and to develop curricular modules. The conservator agreed to supervise provenance research. The work would be long and messy and necessarily incomplete. Still, as the rain eased and the meeting dispersed, there was a palpable sense that the town had, at least for a moment, chosen to let history be a resource rather than a refuge for denial.